She was married to him for 35 years, slept beside him, raised his children, defended his name in church scandals. She believed he was a man of God, but buried behind his house were 4 shallow graves, and one of them was their daughter. Langston Dawes wasn't just a preacher. He was a master manipulator who built an entire legacy on lies. Before marrying Mireille, he had a child with another woman, a lady he later hired into their church, mentored, and impregnated. The woman didn't know he was her father, and his wife didn't know he was grooming his own blood, until she found a box. It started with a shoebox in the garage, ended with a police raid at a youth revival. By then, Mireille had already been pushed out of the church, gaslit into silence, and branded unstable. But when the dirt was lifted, her truth screamed louder than any sermon he ever preached. This wasn't about infidelity. This was about incest, murder, and the kind of evil that wears a cross on Sunday. For over 3 decades, Mireille Dawes was the quiet constant beside one of Utah's most respected religious figures. Her presence was polished, soft-spoken, and never too visible, exactly how her husband preferred it. While Langston Dawes preached revival and righteousness across church pulpits and campgrounds, Mireille became a fixture of silent grace. Most of the congregation assumed she preferred the background. Fewer questioned why that background kept getting darker. By the time rumors of Mireille's mental decline began to spread, the church community hardly blinked. Elders whispered of memory lapses, erratic behavior, and even spiritual confusion. Eventually, she was quietly asked to rest from service attendance for her own health. No formal statement, no open prayer, just absence. Behind closed doors, Langston maintained an image of concern. He told key members she was struggling with early signs of dementia, even brought in a retired nurse to monitor her during Sunday services. But there was no medical file, no diagnosis, and no second opinion. Just an unchallenged narrative that she was slipping. What no one realized was that Mireille wasn't forgetting. She was remembering. In the months leading up to her removal from church duties, Mireille had grown increasingly suspicious of her husband's behavior. His disappearances, the late-night calls, the sudden hostility anytime she asked about certain members of the congregation, particularly a new church worker named Zariah. The woman had joined the church office 2 years prior, handpicked by Langston himself. She was quiet, respectful, and never caused problems. But there was a strange, unspoken familiarity between them that Mireille couldn't explain. What began as quiet unease became a private obsession. Mireille started watching, listening, checking calendars against travel logs. She stopped taking sleeping pills at night, pretending to drift off while Langston stepped outside to make hushed calls. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how wrong until she found the box. The garage had always been Langston's domain. He kept it neat, obsessively labeled, with rows of sermon tapes, sealed crates from mission trips, and old furniture meant for donation. Mireille rarely entered it. But on that Sunday afternoon, with the house to herself and no distractions, she stepped in with a different intent. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Only answers. At first, it was routine. Old hymnals, paint cans, a dented toolbox, and expired revival flyers. But tucked between a stack of damaged Bibles and a roll of unused banner vinyl, she noticed something odd. A shoebox. Worn, taped shut at the corners, and stained from water damage. When she opened it, the weight of what she found didn't land all at once. It came in layers. At the top, folded neatly, was a faded hospital document. Birth certificate. Child, Zariah. Mother, Renee Pelham. Father, Langston Dawes. Mireille's body went cold. She reread the names, then again, then again. The document was nearly 30 years old. Below it were photos, black and white baby pictures. There were also letters. Most were handwritten by Langston himself. He spoke of regret, of a mistake made in his youth, of how the girl had been placed into foster care after her mother's death. One note, dated 3 years before Zariah joined the church, said, "If God is truly forgiving, then this chapter of my life can be redeemed too." Then there was the pamphlet, an old funeral bulletin for Renee Pelham. Cause of death? Postpartum hemorrhage. She had died within hours of childbirth. The child had survived. Mireille kept reading, flipping through pages of Langston's private past. And slowly, the weight began to close in. He hadn't just known about this child. He had tracked her, chosen to re-enter her life, brought her in, not as family, but as staff, quietly, carefully. She placed everything back into the box. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear, from certainty. She now had evidence of a child Langston had hidden for decades. But more disturbing than that was his decision to bring her into the church as a subordinate, to keep her close, under control, without ever disclosing who she really was. There was no letter of adoption, no trace of acknowledgement, no indication of family restoration, only silence, hidden paperwork, and proximity. Mireille didn't sleep that night. She didn't eat. She sat with the box in her lap, cycling through every year of her marriage, every lie told in Sunday suits, every woman Langston warned her not to trust, every church member he removed for disrupting peace. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a pattern, a calculated one. She knew what the next step had to be, but she also understood what it would cost. And somewhere in the back of her mind, one final thought kept circling louder than the rest. Zariah wasn't just brought here. She was brought here for something. Mireille Dawes had found her answer. But what she hadn't yet grasped was just how dangerous the truth would become once it began to unravel. Within months of being hired, Zariah had become one of the most familiar faces in Langston's inner circle. She handled his schedules, coordinated his travel, and often accompanied him to retreats and out-of-town conferences. While other women were kept at arm's length in leadership matters, Zariah's presence was normalized, almost invisible. But something else stood out now. Zariah had begun spending time with Cameron Dawes, Mireille's youngest son. She was almost 10 years older than him. At first, it seemed innocent. Cameron, in his early 20s, was a music coordinator for the youth choir. Their interactions started with logistical tasks, bulletin layouts, sound checks, practice schedules. They kept it a secret because of their age difference, but whispered gossip from other church staff began to unravel the truth. For Mireille, her mind kept circling back to the timeline. Zariah's age, Cameron's age, the family structure, the DNA. If Zariah was Langston's biological daughter, then Cameron had unknowingly begun a relationship with his half-sister. Mireille didn't confront them. Not yet. She didn't trust her emotions, and she certainly didn't trust her safety. Instead, she began watching with more precision. Alone in her room, she reviewed church photos from the past year. Events, retreats, posed pictures. In nearly every frame where Langston and Zariah appeared together, they stood too close. The kind of close that didn't read as spiritual mentorship. The kind that mirrored something else entirely. By the end of the week, Mireille had compiled a private record. Application scans, travel logs, handwritten notes, annotated photos. a private folder, a hidden duplicate of the garage box. She no longer believed she was just dealing with a buried secret. She believed she was watching something dangerous unfold in real time. And guess what? It took an even crazier turn. Zariah Pelham disappeared without a sound. One week, she was managing Langston's travel schedule and organizing women's ministry files. The next, her desk sat untouched, and her name was quietly removed from the Sunday bulletin. No farewell message, no explanation from leadership, just absence. When Mireille asked Milton Greaves, the church elder who once sat at her dining table every Easter, he offered nothing but vague concern. "She stepped away for personal reasons," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Some transitions aren't meant for public processing." But transitions, Mireille thought, didn't leave behind unopened mail. Zariah's paycheck from the previous cycle hadn't been collected. Her office keys were still in her drawer. Her car, which had often been parked near the west lot of the church, hadn't been seen since the weekend Langston returned from a revival in Iron County. Mireille knew better than to push through official channels. Her credibility within the church had already been quietly dismantled. What she needed now was perspective, and someone who hadn't yet been pulled under Langston's narrative. She reached out to Solace, their eldest son, who was a detective in another county. Though still estranged from the family, he agreed to visit under one condition: no direct confrontation. He didn't want to play the hero. He just wanted the truth. When he arrived, Mireille showed him everything: the documents, the letters, the application, the photo. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Where was she last seen? The answer was simple, but haunting: the retreat house. Langston had always spoken of the retreat house as a place of restoration. Built by church donations, nestled along a quiet road an hour from town, the house served as a getaway for spiritual reflection. Langston often went there alone, or sometimes with mentees in need of counsel. Zariah had accompanied him there several times in the past year, usually under the pretext of handling logistics for youth events. Mireille had always assumed others were present. Now, she wasn't so sure. They drove out late on a Thursday afternoon. The house was still, locked from the front, windows drawn. The grounds around it were mostly unkempt: patches of dry grass, a rusted swing set left from an earlier generation of visitors, and the smell of soil long undisturbed. But it was the back of the property that stopped them cold. Near the tree line, behind a faded tool shed, was a section of dirt unlike the rest. The grass was sparse, the soil looked newer, turned over in uneven rectangles. No markers, no stones, just earth that had clearly been moved, recently and multiple times. Solace took a photo with his phone. Neither said the word out loud, but both were thinking it: graves. They left without disturbing anything, but the weight followed them home. Mireille began recording everything: time-stamped notes, property observations, photographic comparisons with older images from retreat events. She checked attendance logs for Langston's travel. The dates aligned too neatly. One visit, then another, then another, each connected to a woman who had left the church under odd circumstances. One had been accused of inappropriate clothing. Another had been emotionally unstable. Zariah was now the latest, but none of them had ever reappeared, and none of them had ever spoken again. The retreat house was no longer a place of rest. It was a place of silence, and Mireille had just walked its perimeter. The return to the retreat house wasn't casual. This time, Mireille and Solace weren't alone. With mounting concern and documentation in hand, Solace had reached out to a local officer named Cheryl Knox, one of the few in the area not directly connected to Langston's congregation. Quietly, off-record, they handed over copies of the documents, photos of the altered soil behind the shed, and a timeline cross-matching staff disappearances with Langston's unlogged retreat stays. Knox didn't dismiss it. 2 days later, they called back. A formal warrant followed within the week, issued with minimal attention. The property was listed as church-owned and rarely monitored. It was just enough to proceed without alerting Langston, who was away at a youth revival 3 counties over. On the morning of the dig, a small team arrived under the guise of environmental inspection. The first shovel sank barely 2 feet before it hit cloth. What came next was methodical. 4 rectangular sites, each marked by subtle disturbances in the terrain. No headstones, no identifiers, just layered soil and signs of hand-packed burial. Forensic technicians worked silently as each shallow grave was exposed one by one. The first contained the remains of a teenage girl, bones still partially clothed, fabric remnants indicating a summer dress, likely buried without ceremony. The second was a woman in her early 30s, based on skeletal analysis. A single earring was still attached to her left ear. 1 shoe was missing. The third grave revealed a different kind of violence: fractured ribs, a healed wrist break long before death, and evidence of restraint. This body had been laid in a twisted position, inconsistent with natural decomposition. And then came the fourth. The soil packed tighter. Newer. The remains were that of an adult woman. The features were more intact. Her hair, preserved in sections, still clung to the scalp. A single bracelet remained around the left wrist, purple, plastic, etched faintly with letters Zariah. Cheryl Knox paused. She didn't call out. She didn't announce anything. But the team moved differently from that point forward. By afternoon, the retreat property was fully sealed off. A local coroner arrived for field evaluation. Mireille was asked to step back, but she'd already seen enough. 4 women, all connected to the church. All now confirmed dead on church-owned land. All hidden behind a tool shed no one was ever meant to examine. Langston had referred to the retreat house as a sacred space, a place where healing happened, a place where judgment had no home. But what lay beneath it told a different story. Langston Dawes was no longer just a preacher. He was now the primary suspect in a quadruple homicide investigation. And as Mireille stood at the edge of the crime scene tape, she realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Inside the Dawes home, there was one place Mireille hadn't yet searched: Langston's locked desk drawer. Following the grave discovery, law enforcement returned with a warrant to search the residence. Most of Langston's belongings were curated: sermon notes, theological books, pastoral correspondence. But in the locked drawer, tucked beneath a stack of fundraising flyers, they found it: a black leather-bound journal, unmarked on the front, filled with handwritten entries dating back over a decade. It wasn't a diary. It was a log of thoughts, reflections, and confessions Langston never meant to share. What stood out immediately were the references to her. Early entries hinted at spiritual confusion. One note read, "I've prayed, I've fasted, but the feeling remains." Perhaps this is not temptation, but restoration of what was broken. As investigators moved deeper into the journal, her became a name: Zariah. Langston had known all along. One entry, dated the year before she was hired, stated, "I watched her from across the church courtyard. She has Renee's eyes. I knew immediately." There was no confusion in the writing, no denial, Langston Dawes had deliberately inserted his daughter into his ministry without disclosure, cloaked it in religious language, and maintained complete control over her access, employment, and visibility. But Zariah wasn't the only name in the journal. There were coded references to the other victims, each framed as spiritual liabilities. The counselor, Ebony Miro, had once requested to lead a workshop on boundaries in ministry. Langston wrote that she disrupted pastoral alignment. Tirzah Rowe, a vocal church member, had challenged his teachings on submission. Langston labeled her a destabilizing voice and warned himself to remove access before infection spreads. The youngest, Shanika Vallon, was a teen revival attendee who went missing shortly after a camp event. Langston wrote that some spirits are too dangerous to be restored, and that removal was sometimes part of the shepherd's burden. Each woman had been reduced to a threat in his ledger, and each had disappeared shortly after being labeled one. Langston hadn't just hidden crimes. He had justified them, ritualized them. Mireille didn't speak when the officers showed her the book. She didn't cry, didn't faint. She only asked for one thing: a photocopy of the entries with Zariah's name. Because she had spent decades married to a man who quoted scripture like breath. But she had never seen it weaponized with such precision. Not until now. And what lay ahead would no longer be managed in secret. It would be tried in court. Langston Dawes was scheduled to preach at a 3-day youth revival in a neighboring county. It was the perfect environment for spiritual isolation and, as it turned out, arrest. By the time the revival began, law enforcement had already built the case. The shallow graves were confirmed. DNA testing linked the remains to missing persons tied directly to Langston's church. The journal entries, now scanned and catalogued, outlined patterns of grooming, spiritual coercion, and premeditated abuse. Mireille had turned over her collected files, photos, timelines, duplicate documents. Voicemail recordings confirmed Langston had blocked any further inquiry into Zariah's whereabouts within church leadership, and yet Langston preached without hesitation. On the second night of the revival, standing beneath a wooden cross and flanked by youth choir banners, he spoke on the danger of inner rebellion. Witnesses described his tone as passionate, convicted, almost euphoric. He didn't see the officers approach. Cheryl Knox led the team, arriving just after dusk. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting. She walked straight to the platform, displayed the warrant, and instructed him to step down. Langston paused only briefly. Then, wordlessly, he complied. A handful of church elders in attendance watched from the crowd. A few stepped forward in confusion. Others remained still, as if unsure whether what they were seeing was real. Langston didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He only looked out at the stunned congregation, nodded once, and allowed the handcuffs to be placed. By morning, the news had spread locally. The preacher known for unity and peace was now in custody for multiple homicide investigations. Among the charges, concealment of death, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and incest. Internally, the board scrambled. Langston's most loyal supporters moved to control the narrative, calling it a smear campaign, a spiritual attack, a misunderstanding. But the facts were no longer speculative. Forensic reports, DNA matches, and journal entries were hard data. And the images of officers walking Langston off a revival stage were now circulating online. Langston Dawes, the man once invited to open regional conventions and lead marriage panels, was now wearing a county-issued jumpsuit behind a steel door. The silence that had once protected him had collapsed. And for Mireille Dawes, the woman the church tried to erase, The risk she took in exposing the truth had now dismantled an entire legacy. The next time Langston would speak, it wouldn't be from a pulpit. It would be under oath. The trial of Langston Dawes began less than 5 months after his arrest. The court opted for an expedited schedule due to the weight of evidence and public pressure for resolution. The prosecution entered the courtroom with over 300 pieces of material, physical, digital, and testimonial. It wasn't a case built on speculation. It was built on bodies. The opening statements laid the tone. Prosecutors detailed how Langston had used his position to manipulate, exploit, and ultimately silence women connected to his church. The jury was shown images of the retreat property, aerial footage of the excavation, and autopsy reports confirming trauma, improper burial, and in at least one case, physical restraint before death. But it was the forensic DNA report that cut deepest. Zariah Pelham's remains were tested twice. Each result confirmed the same truth. She was the biological daughter of Langston Dawes, and she had been carrying a fetus at the time of her death, also confirmed by post-mortem analysis. It left no room for interpretation. Langston Dawes had impregnated his own daughter, and shortly after she threatened to come forward, he eliminated her. One after another, the threads unraveled. Ebony Moreau had filed a private complaint months before her dismissal. The records had been buried, never passed to the elder board. The surviving copy, recovered from her sister's home, accused Langston of inappropriate conduct and professional retaliation. She disappeared weeks later. Tirza Rowe, once a teacher in the church's women's program, had been warned privately to stop questioning doctrine before she was removed. Her last known location was at the retreat house. Her remains were found with fractured ribs and no burial garments. Shenika Vallen's parents had reported her missing after a revival event Langston led personally. She had no history of running away. Her disappearance had been quietly categorized as a likely voluntary exit. Now her remains told a different story. Witnesses took the stand. Most were former church members, some reluctant, others quietly defiant. A few recounted how Langston preached forgiveness, while often isolating women who spoke out. Several admitted they once defended him, dismissing early warning signs as spiritual attacks or jealousy. Langston's defense team attempted a religious framing, suggesting his journal was metaphorical, not literal. But the combination of Zariah's employment records, her pregnancy, the burial on church property, and the journal's language made that argument impossible to sustain. Cameron Dawes never testified. He attended the trial once for one day, sitting near the back of the room. He left before the forensic team discussed the paternity evidence. Silas Dawes did take the stand. He spoke in measured tones, not of betrayal, but of patterns, how his father controlled the narrative for decades, and how questions were always met with anger or silence. His testimony wasn't emotional, it was surgical. Mireille Dawes sat quietly throughout. No sunglasses, no press interviews, just presence. On the 9th day, Langston Dawes was found guilty on all counts: 4 counts of murder, 1 count of incest, 1 count of obstruction, and multiple counts of abuse of position and evidence tampering. He was sentenced to life without parole. He showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. No apology, no explanation, no final statement. The man once known for his voice had nothing more to say. No public acknowledgement of the victims, no statement to the community, no outreach to the families of the women whose bodies were recovered from their own retreat property. The pulpit stood empty for 2 Sundays before a replacement pastor, temporary, unnamed, began rotating through pre-written sermons on grace and endurance. the retreat house was boarded up. The land was later sold, then razed. What once hosted youth revivals and spiritual retreats was now nothing but bare soil and silence. And Mireille Dawes, once erased by whispers of dementia and mental decline, was asked to speak only once. It happened a year after the verdict. A journalist named Naomi Trent, known for investigative faith reporting, approached Mireille for an exclusive sit-down. The interview aired late on a Sunday night, barely advertised, but it spread quickly. Mireille appeared older. Not frail, but different. Sharper in silence than she had ever been in presence. When asked why she never spoke out earlier, she said nothing for a long time. Then finally replied, "Because I was trained to believe submission meant survival." She shared only what the courts had already confirmed. She didn't elaborate on pain, didn't reflect on her marriage. She declined to discuss her children. What she did speak about, clearly, steadily, was the pattern. How a man like Langston had been protected by structure, by silence, by belief. And then, just before the interview ended, Naomi asked one final question. What would you want people to remember about all of this? Mireille didn't hesitate. She looked at the camera and said, "There are men who break their vows, and there are men who bury their secrets. I married both." She declined further interviews, moved out of the family home. Her name disappeared from the church directory, her presence erased from decades of ministry archives. To this day, no formal monument exists for the women who were buried behind the retreat. No ceremony, no song, just time and silence. And somewhere, in another church, another city, another community, another woman is starting to ask questions, because in places where faith is used as insulation instead of illumination, truth takes longer to rise, but it still does. Thanks for watching.